I think we can start. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to CSIS regional lecture series on regional dynamics. And we are very happy today that we have one excellent speaker, Dr. Stephanie Martel from the Queen's University, to talk with us on the topic of the future of ASEAN security community. And this is very much related to her recent book that's being published in 2022 on enacting a security community. And the topic itself, I think, is very, very relevant. As we know, Indonesia is now Dr. Stephanie Martel from the Queen's University to talk with us on the topic. Some technical glitch, sorry. So I think it is the right momentum to have a discussion on this particular topic today, because Indonesia is, as we know, is chairing ASEAN, particularly this year, you know. And then we know there has been a lot of expectations just even before Indonesia taking up the chairmanship this year. Practically because one of the key issue is the so-called ASEAN vision that we have, you know, the ASEAN community vision. It's going to be, I don't know whether I use the correct word, expired very soon in 2025. And ASEAN now already created the so-called high-level task force to create the post-2025 vision. And Indonesia has managed to push it a little bit further beyond 10 years time frame into 20 years. So we will, ASEAN, I mean, is aiming to see until 2045 vision. So we know ASEAN now is in really turbulent situation. We see now internally ASEAN is having a problem, you know, as we can see is the Myanmar crisis, for example. So we have the very, very problematic crisis here right in the region. At the same time, we are in the region also seeing the intensifying major powers, great powers rivalries. And exactly because of these challenges, we need to really reflect back to the idea of having the security community here in the region with ASEAN security community. And of course, we come up with some questions, you know. When we talk about security community, in what stage now is ASEAN in the process of becoming this security community? Especially, again, as I mentioned earlier, the vision itself is going to be expired, meaning the security community should actually be established by now. And then always the question is where ASEAN is heading to amidst this, you know, really serious challenges that we are having. How ASEAN is going to thrive toward its future. And particularly for Indonesia, I think the questions really, because many has, you know, portrayed Indonesia as quote unquote a natural leader here in the region. How or what role should Indonesia play to lift up to the idea of making ASEAN as a security community? How should Indonesia display its leadership? And particularly the ultimate question is whether ASEAN going to outlive the expectations to be an effective and relevant organization and not really moving toward its end game, or what we phrased it earlier, you know, when we respond to the recent ASEAN summit, we are certainly would like to see ASEAN is not moving toward its self-destruction, you know, because it's going to be a very, very, very grim future if that happens to be the case here in the region. So with that, some introduction, I would like to just briefly share with you the biography of Dr. Stephanie Martel as our speaker today. Dr. Stephanie Martel is the assistant professor in the Department of Political Studies and also the director of the Center of International and Defense Policy, and also the Distinguished Fellow at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. And her research on multilateral diplomacy and regional security governance, focusing on Southeast Asia and Indo-Pacific. And recently also, I heard from Dr. Martel that she's also doing a recent project on women, peace, and security here in the region. So with that, I would like to give the time and floor for Dr. Martel. And I believe her presentation will be very, very relevant and useful for us today. Please, Dr. Martel.
Thank you so much, Lina, for this introduction, and many thanks for the invitation to visit CSIS again. It has been a long time, too long a time that I've been able to come here and visit you. The last time I was here was 2015. I was still carrying on the research that ultimately led to the book that I'm going to draw my remarks from today. And this project was also developed through a number of conversations that I've had across the region with people who are directly involved in shaping the security agenda of ASEAN, but many of those people were at CSIS, so these conversations that I've had with CSIS researchers are also a big part of what led to this particular outcome in the book. So these initial remarks that I'm going to make will draw from my book here, but I hope that the conversation afterwards can lead us into productive directions in terms of providing maybe some answers to the questions, the excellent questions that today's event were framed around. Yes. So yes, it's right there. Okay, great. And so situating ASEAN's journey on the path towards a security community will allow me to set the stage for perhaps some ideas on where ASEAN itself might go next, but also Indonesia's leadership within it. And I'm, of course, very much looking forward to also learning from you in the audience through discussion of ongoing challenges and opportunities for perhaps an enhanced role of ASEAN in regional security governance. So whenever I speak about this topic in Canada, I usually have to start with an ASEAN 101 crash course, which fortunately I don't have to do here. So that saves me a lot of time to actually discuss substance. So I'm very happy with that. But it's always a pleasure, but also a challenge to speak to an audience such as this particular audience, because you are all so daily immersed in a topic that unfortunately I need to most of the time study from afar. And so I don't know how much you will learn from me today, actually, but hopefully what I can do is offer a different perspective than the ones that you're used to, and an opportunity, hopefully, for lively discussion afterwards. So this is a book about ASEAN, its security community building project more specifically. And the starting point of that project is that if ASEAN is in fact a talk shop, like many like to suggest, then we actually need to take this much more seriously. And I think we should actually care a lot about how ASEAN and the people involved in regional security governance talk about the security community, because that's how the security community is very much brought into existence. It's through talking about it. And there are a number of reasons why we should pay attention to the power of language and discourse and the way that we talk and write about ASEAN security community. The first reason is that it's through language that actors and we around the room process our reality. We cannot make sense of the world around us. We cannot make sense of regional or world politics without language. And instead of offering an assessment of whether ASEAN is or isn't a security community according to some academic definition of the term, typically, based on Western experience also, or to try to predict whether ASEAN will ever become one in the future if we agree that it's not there yet. I want to do something else. As I start with the meaning that people who are invested daily in the process of making ASEAN such a community give to it. I think this is what requires more attention from researchers and possibly policymakers as well. A second reason why we should pay attention to talk and the power of words in bringing about the security community is that, interestingly, ASEAN itself has come to realize that discourse is power quite explicitly. First, on December 31st, 2015, ASEAN formally established its community, while at the very same time acknowledging that actually it wasn't quite one yet, but that, didn't really matter. And so we would push to the next stage, right? And come up with this vision. And so that can also inform how we approach, what the next vision is going to look like and what we can expect. And then in August 2020, as I was writing this book, ASEAN held a consultation whose explicitly stated objective was to provide a narrative on ASEAN's identity that would address a set of key questions framed by the ASEAN Secretary General himself. Who are we? What do we stand for? And what does ASEAN mean? These were the questions that were explicitly framed as the topic of this consultation. And the fact that ASEAN could declare itself a security community without having answers to these questions is already telling, right? And it's not a sign of failure, or not just that, at least, but a testament to the power of discourse and how it matters, right? And so this is what leads me to talk about ASEAN's project to become a security community as a never-ending story. And why is that? Why is it never-ending? The starting point to begin to provide an answer to that question is that people invested in making ASEAN security community a reality actually channel not one, but three, at least, versions of the security community. And these different versions on what it means for ASEAN to become a security community, to have regional security, to be a community, can actually never be fully reconciled. And so that's what makes ASEAN's quest to become a security community very likely to be never ending. And these are versions of the security community that are not only distinct, but are also, interestingly, rooted in competing and possibly even incompatible views of what both security and community mean in the context of ASEAN. And this actually helps us, I argue, understand ASEAN's journey up to now, but also where it is likely to go next. But also why it may never actually reach its endpoint. And that's because there is no endpoint, really, or that the endpoint itself has kept changing over time, but will probably keep on changing as well. So that the ASEAN security community has several meanings, or that ASEAN pursues several security communities, plural, at once, actually works in ASEAN's favor. That's the second core part of my argument. It's not a flaw. It's not an incoherent approach, right? It is actually built in its very design, even if it wasn't necessarily the intent. It's what allows ASEAN to attract continuous support across a variety of stakeholders with very different views on what it means to have security, despite the fact that it continues to fail to deliver on its many promises. And in my view, this is a very important story that deserves to be better understood, as opposed to just dismissed as insignificant or meaningless or just words. That the ASEAN security community has different meanings also means that ASEAN is actually set on distinct paths towards the realization of the security community. So it's not just a matter of assessing where ASEAN is on that one path towards its security community, What I suggest in the book is that actually ASEAN pursues different paths simultaneously. And so in the book, what I do is I trace how ASEAN came to launch itself on these distinct paths, how these paths also overlap and conflict with one another. And I refer to the different versions of the security community as being rooted in distinct stories that people tell about ASEAN's role in bringing the security community into being. And much of where ASEAN seems to be currently heading also follows these paths. This is very much a story of incremental change within continuity. It's not just a straightforward, linear, or unidirectional path. Instead, it's omnidirectional. It has multiple directions at once. And so I'm happy to get into any specifics when it comes to the various parts of the book during the Q&A. I just wanted to provide a brief overview of the structure here. But before I start unpacking the stories that I mentioned a little bit, I just want you to please remember throughout that to be compelling, a story needs to be grounded in truth, at least partially, right? So the fact that I called them stories doesn't mean that they're false or rooted in fiction. To the contrary. And I do not myself make a judgment on which parts of ASEAN's story are more or less true. What I do instead is I channel other people's views, including the people I spoke with at CSIS, among others, on this instead. And I will leave it to you to make up your own mind as well. As I go through these various stories, it's very possible that people in this room will find some stories to be more compelling or more convincing than others. I leave this up to you. What I suspect is that people in this room might have very different views on this as well. Sorry, I'm having some technical issues over here. And so I will say that all of these versions, again, are equally grounded, at least partly in truth, despite being in tension. They are in tension with one another. And people finding these stories compelling or reproducing them are not wrong in any way either. To the contrary, but at the same time, and this is the paradox, they actually cannot all be right at the same time. And yet they are. And so this is where the power of words and the power of discourse actually becomes quite important. And it cannot make sense that they are all right, these stories at the same time, without a better understanding of how the power of discourse works in practice. Okay, so let me start unpacking these stories and giving a bit more practical flesh to this discussion. So the first version that I unpack of ASEAN's story to become a security community, I refer to as the non-traditional security community. And its starting point is the view that ASEAN and the region itself is broadly at peace, right? Defined as, the absence of war, especially between states. And it is therefore first and foremost impacted by what has come to be referred to as non-traditional security threats, which, as you very well know, is a broad, some would say ill-defined category of issues that encompasses many different challenges that are typically non-military or transnational in nature. And typically this story will invoke a number of boogeymen, as I refer to them in the book. So pirates, criminals, terrorists, and these boogeymen operate in between spaces, typically outside the gaze of the state. They're out to get ASEAN, and they can never be totally eradicated. And yet ASEAN and the champions of this version present the security community as the solution that will allow ASEAN to do so. For example, by making ASEAN drug-free. And the book goes into a fair bit of detail as to how ASEAN got to define its security role, first, through a focus on drug trafficking, and then moving to transnational crime, and then adding that non-traditional security label. And of course, securitization, some of you maybe have heard that term before, is very much part of that story. But what's interesting, if I can suggest so, in that particular part of the book, is that I also look into tensions and contradictions that accompany the retelling of this story, the opposition that this story faces, the challenges that it faces from people within ASEAN who will challenge it. And so people who will challenge this story will bring up a number of different positions. So some of them will say, you know, oh, this focus on non-traditional security, really it's a pretext to avoid dealing with the real hard, you know, defense security issues. Or some will say it's problematic because it presupposes this alignment between the security of the state on the one hand and the security of the people, but we know that in a number of instances, these two clash with each other, right? They're not necessarily always compatible. Or some people will also say that what is presented as new or non-traditional is actually very old and quite traditional for the region, including Indonesia, and how such countries have been thinking about their security since, you know, their creation as states, right? And so I'm sure many of you have heard these arguments before, and maybe you've even raised them yourselves. Whatever emerging issues ASEAN is currently adding to its security agenda, for instance, any focus on the security implications of new technologies. I was talking earlier to a CSIS researcher working on AI. This will likely kind of build on past moments in that story. The second version of the security community is, I refer to it as a traditional one, meaning that the story presented is pretty much a back to the future scenario, where the region first and foremost ought to worry about a return to interstate conflict and possibly war. And the focus here is on flashpoints like the South China Sea, of course, others as well, but also broader patterns of major power rivalry. And here ASEAN is basically presented as a David facing giants, or if we use the metaphor I used in the book, facing dragons. And it is presented as this sort of hero, but really anti-hero in the sense that it doesn't have the traditional characteristics of what a hero would look like, right? There are a lot of arguments about ASEAN having strength and weakness, etc. And because of these kind of weaker capabilities, or weaker in terms of in a material sense, in a conventional sense, but not actually weaker necessarily, that it is able to play this role as the kind of honest broker of major power relations. And so this narrative will justify also more specific initiatives, the code of conduct on the South China Sea, for instance, or the promotion of ASEAN centrality in the broader regional security architecture, typically against attempts to push for non-ASEAN centric alternatives. And so the book discusses recent debates around the Quad and the free and open and now inclusive Indo-Pacific against the backdrop of previous moments in what has become quite a familiar scenario for those who are paying attention. And it's a scenario where ASEAN, every time its role is questioned by its dialogue partners, is able to reassert itself in extremis as the only possible vehicle for peace between states in the Asia-Indo-Pacific. And it's a scenario in which all of its dialogue partners, perhaps reluctantly, typically have no other choice in the end but to agree that if ASEAN didn't exist, it would need to be created. You've heard this before, I'm sure, and many times. And so, of course, lip service to ASEAN centrality is certainly an issue, and ASEAN's discursive power here is not without challenge, but it's nonetheless pretty impressive. And interestingly, this version also connects with non-traditional security. And you will come to learn through the talk that non-traditional security is actually pretty much everywhere in here. But it's presented in that particular story in a very different light. Here, non-traditional security is not important in and of itself, but it's a set of low-hanging fruits or soft issues that will, at best, build confidence and trust between states, necessary to then perhaps at some point address the real hard, important stuff the hard concerns, either indirectly or in due time when the time is ripe, etc. And at worst, as a pretext to hold more serious conversations on the margins of meetings. And this is not me saying this, right? I'm, again, channeling other people's views here. The third version of the security community is a people-centered one. You might call it a people-oriented or people-driven version if you prefer. I'll let you choose your preferred label. But it's the one that is the closest to what could be said might be some kind of a regional version of human security or the responsibility to protect, which of course remain understandably controversial in this region. And here I discuss a broad variety of issues that sometimes, again, will cross over with non-traditional security. But in this particular story, I'm much less focused on fighting the boogeyman through security or defense forces, but much more focused on providing security to the people of ASEAN on an everyday basis against pandemics, against disasters, or more recently through a regional women, peace and security agenda. And here this story is actually actively contested. What ASEAN tells about itself is contested by a well-established regional network of peace and security activists who are, have become more and more proficient in calling out ASEAN for failing to uphold its aspirations to form a security community in practice. So instead of just criticizing ASEAN, what they will do and say, ASEAN, you are failing to meet your own aspirations to become a people-centric security community. And here's what you should be doing instead, right? And so I track the ability of these actors who name and shame ASEAN to use various discursive practices to shape its approach over time. And we see that as a result, ASEAN's approach is transformed, although incrementally, possibly, you know, from the perspective of its critics, it's not enough, but we can still trace some change in its approach happening. And here the chapter covers issues like peacekeeping, the Rohingya crisis, trafficking in persons, etc. And while most of the manuscript was completed before the coup in Myanmar, it does situate the current conflict against the backdrop of a broader and long-standing Myanmar problem for the organization that, and again, sees ASEAN's approach evolve over time. And again, even as many would, and deservedly so, point out that it's probably not enough and that ASEAN could be doing more. So all of these stories are equally true. If I asked you to choose which story you found the most compelling or important, if you had to choose, probably we would get very different answers in this room. And of course, this will change also depending on what people consider to be the most important issue of the day. It's also not like people need to pick just one. Some will, but you know, in fact, many of the people I've spoke with actually channel different versions of the security community depending on where the conversation is going. And this is despite the fact that the stories cannot help but contradicting each other sometimes. And all of these stories remain prevalent in ASEAN, although again, their salience might shift depending on the most pressing issue of the day, but they are also all contested and challenged. And none of this is a fault or a defect. Instead, it's just a testament to how elusive it is to pursue security, right? We can never feel 100% secure. So that's not just ASEAN, it's every regional organization embarked on the quest to bring about security, really, that is faced with this never-ending story to some extent. And so questions about the future of ASEAN, whether it will be able to survive the latest crisis, etc., these have been a recurring topic of discussion, and what could even say going back to the very inception of ASEAN. Despite its many limitations, which people, you know, spend a lot of time documenting and speaking about, ASEAN has proven to be quite a resilient institution over time. And it continues to escape predictions of its death foretold. It's taking on more and more issues, including security ones, as part of an ever-growing agenda. It continues to foster expressions of support to its centrality, leading much more powerful others to adjust to its own views on how regional security and order ought to be pursued. And we see this happening quite clearly around the Quad and the Indo-Pacific, and current debates on the rules-based order, including this weekend in Singapore at the Shangri-La Dialogue. This is very much on display there. Even ASEAN's most fervent critics ultimately agree that the world would be a better place if ASEAN could only realize its stated aspirations and had more resources to do so. So for an organization like ASEAN, this is quite extraordinary, actually. And I hope I've been able to convince you that it cannot really make sense unless we take the power of discourse and language seriously. Terima kasih. I look forward to your questions and the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, for your excellent presentation and kind of sneak peek to the book itself. And I think I personally really look forward to read the book by myself. But anyway, I think a lot of self-reflection and at this juncture, I think that kind of self-reflection about ASEAN stories itself is very, very pertinent, especially again, as I mentioned earlier in the introduction, is as ASEAN is trying to formulate a new vision, that kind of question, about and the fact that about the necessity of talking about ASEAN itself, to do the reflection of what is ASEAN, what are we, and what kind of stories that we want to have, which is the reality itself. It's not something that is just simply a story, but something that is the story that can really tell how effective ASEAN is as a regional organization. So I think I would like to open the floor for discussion, questions. Yeah, Mbak Susi, Wafa, is there maybe one more? One more? Okay, I open the first round first, and then after that I open for the second and maybe third round. We still have quite some time. Silakan, Mbak Susi, please. Maybe identify yourself just quickly.
I'm Susie. I'm a researcher at UI and INADIS. I want to approach this from two dimensions. The first one is the formulation of foreign policy is usually can be done through systemic or decision-making process or the cognitive. Related to the cognitive side, which is very closely related to discourses. The cognitive side we see in ASEAN are communities with different religions and different cognitive ability, unlike the European Union that has Christianity as an emphasis of unity. And discourse or rhetoric, in the rhetorical textbooks, we need to have the same thing like the West does have, which is ethos, pathos, and in rhetoric, you have to have someone like Kissinger who constantly be referred to, and then his discourse is acceptable. So in terms of this diversity and the cognitive ability to sort of merge these different source of beliefs, I think it influences the way whether ASEAN can really become a security community, because their views are so different. Ethos, pathos, logos. That's the base of rhetoric. Okay, that's my first cut into this. What do you think of what I think?
Okay.
Because the cognitive elements is important.
Yeah. Thank you, Masusi. Wafa?
Right. So hi, Dr. Martel. My name is Wafa from CSIS. So I think for undergraduate and postgrad, I do the same thing with you. I remember just mixing up comics and comic strips and everything, because I do discourse analysis as well. So I have to ask. So the power of discourse is the ability of being familiar, right? Of previously, omnipresently referred to in the region. So something that Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, everyone has familiarity with, right? And what has united ASEAN, I think I agree with you, is that there's a monster outside. So we're quite united when we're talking about major power conflict, US-China rivalry. And then I agree also with you with the story of the boogeymans, the non-state boogeymans, and we're also quite active in non-traditional securities and as well, like SOMTC and everywhere, the work plans are great. Now the next step for me, one of the next steps in the security community is in facing the demons inside. So human rights issues, ability to be relevant to the people. Because how can you have a security community whose community-driven approach is supposedly to provide for the community at the people level, but the community is prevented from saying anything towards one another, right? So for me, the next step for the security community is to be relevant. So from your observation, do you see any stories, any rooted discourse that is relevant for this? Because all the stories are about facing the monsters inside, but is there any ASEAN stories, ASEAN folktales of popular culture that you observe that can be relevant to, because it's quite hard for, of course, Indonesians or Malaysians to talk from between neighbors to refer to this same spirit that can, you know, whenever we criticize the countries like Myanmar, what sort of, because whenever that happens, you know, so there's a lack of a story that we can refer to. So thank you.
Good morning. Thank you very much for that interesting presentation. I'm Darren. I'm from the Philippines. I am from Osaka University, PhD student. It's my second day in Indonesia. I agree with you regarding the power of discourse, the importance of the power of discourse. So my question is on some of the on epistemology and the use of language. So related to the second question, and this is because I've noticed that your titles have allusions to Charles Dickens, to Mary Shelley, you know, the Latin hic draconis. So whose lens or criteria are we going to use to identify, compile, and actually validate these ASEAN stories? And the second, on the use of boogeyman. I'm familiar with boogeyman, and I understand that the book is in English, but the thing is that how is it manifested in Southeast Asia, the concept of this boogeyman? I think in English, a boogeyman is used to scare people into, children to obey, you know, the adults, the parents. So do Southeast Asians use this boogeyman to make ASEAN behave the way it should behave? Or so in these contexts, how is this boogeyman manifested in Southeast Asia, and what is the relationship of Southeast Asians with this boogeyman? Thank you very much.
These are excellent questions and challenging questions. I'll do my best to address them. You've thrown a lot of very thought-provoking questions at me. So starting with the cognitive dimension, and this is where probably you will find that the book falls short to some extent. You might be a bit disappointed in the sense that my approach, which focuses on discourse as discourse, right, really focuses on what people say and write about something. But I refrain from trying to open up people's heads to figure out what's inside. Right? So what I do is I take no position on whether people telling me what they're telling me actually believe what they say, or why they might be telling me certain things, or why they might be saying certain things about the ASEAN security community, even publicly or in declarations. And I'm not saying they're lying, right? I just don't go there. What I look at is how people talk and write about the security community and what effects it has on the way that ASEAN's role is determined, how certain problems are framed, and then therefore what kind of policy solutions become self-evident, while others are discarded as being unrealistic or not appropriate. So I don't spend too much time no time at all going into the cognitive aspects. Other people do that. So you will probably see some similarities in the title of the book with Amitav Acharya's work. So it's not a coincidence. He is the co-editor of the series that published the book, and we've had many conversations about this project. I'm fortunate enough to say that he was quite supportive of it, although I come at this from a different perspective that he does. So I don't go into cognitive priors, for instance, to explain what the discourse looks like. What I do instead is to focus on what prior discourses came about, how ASEAN, basically how the narrative about ASEAN being a security community developed over time. And so I trace the various debates that policymakers involved in that process had in shaping the end game, basically for ASEAN, shaping the project. But I don't go into too much in terms of why people say the things that they say. I just focus on what effects, what impacts it has. So I hope that helps kind of situating at least where I'm coming from. And of course here the idea, and I think we are no longer in the business as international relations scholars of trying to develop a grand theory that's going to explain everything and about a particular issue, right? So there's a division of labor here. My approach allows me to say or eliminate certain parts of ASEAN's story. And of course, you know, there are many other dimensions. There's material factors obviously matter quite a bit in that story as well. It's just that I see this as more kind of a division of labor. And so I eliminate a part of ASEAN's story that I think deserves more attention, has not been paid enough attention. And then I leave the maybe the interrogation about the cognitive aspects to somebody else, and perhaps you. So thank you. Thank you for that question. It's so excellent. And I think this will help us figure out a way for ASEAN in terms of what comes next. And you're absolutely right. You know, for a story to be compelling, it needs to be familiar. I think you've also pinpointed something very important, is that effective stories or stories that are easier to sell will focus much less on the internal demons, but will try to instead focus on the others, right? The threats that are coming from the outside. And here, ASEAN's focus on non-traditional security is very interesting in that respect, because you could see, you know, these threats as coming from within, but they are instead presented as being in some kind of transnational space that's beyond the realm of any particular state, right? And therefore, it's a way for ASEAN to avoid pinpointing responsibility on a fellow ASEAN member states when it comes to, you know, issues like drug use or terrorism or, you know, others. And so I think probably, as you point out, what's probably next for ASEAN to be able to tackle perhaps more directly is the demons from within. I think the one story that, and again, I say story, but that's not to mean it's fictional. I just want to stress that again, right? It's very much anchored in reality. I think the third version, the people-centered ASEAN security community, is probably the version that potentially would allow ASEAN to deal with these internal demons more than the other two, because it's shifting the goal a little bit to, you know, providing security to the people of ASEAN means also facing possibly, you know, civil conflicts within, etc. And I think that, you know, in this sense, I think Indonesia, this is a testament to Indonesia's leadership in ASEAN as well, to be able to share its own experiences as a way to invite others to do the same, right? And obviously there are limitations when it comes to the current moment of the Myanmar crisis, when it comes to whatever, you know, possibilities this opens up in terms of addressing, you know, the the very concrete, very violent problems and in terms of people-centered security in ASEAN. But I think that's where probably the institution needs to keep developing more capacity in terms of opening up space for having these very hard conversations about what happens inside a particular member state's own borders, but also being, of course, mindful that ASEAN will probably need to develop a good story to justify how to do that in a way that aligns with its approach in its flexible approach to non-interference, et cetera. So this is a major challenge, I think, for the organization. But to answer your question as to which version of the security community possibly opens up space to do that, the third one would be the most likely contender. And then, yes, so to go back to explain the metaphor a little bit, so you're right to point out that these might seem like the monsters metaphor that I invoke are pretty, Western-centric stories. The example of the boogeyman in particular is interesting because actually, the term boogeyman, and I'm not a literature specialist here, but at least what I could make of it is that the term boogeyman is actually rooted or derived from Bugismen, right? So there is a Southeast Asian backstory to the creation of that particular Western, monster. And so I think this illustrates how it's a very good example to show that sometimes we attribute certain things to Western creations, whereas we actually need to recover the global South or Southeast Asian even origins of certain concepts that we make up to be. And we could apply this to, even things like women, peace, and security, or things like human security or the responsibility to protect. Sometimes we see this as being Western liberal agendas because the West is very good at basically stealing everybody else's ideas. But sometimes it's a worthy enterprise to recover the origins of certain concepts. And again, I'm not the only one saying this, and Amitav Acharya, among others, has done great work in terms of trying to figure that out. So whose criteria to validate the stories? And here again, you mentioned epistemology. This is where I don't go, meaning that what I'm interested in is how people in this region who are, again, invested in making the ASEAN security community a reality, how they judge themselves, the stories, and according to criteria that are from, elaborated by the people who are directly engaged in this, as opposed to some, academic, definition of whether ASEAN is or isn't ticks the boxes that it needs to tick to actually be a fully fledged security community. I find that to be much less interesting than refocusing on what people in this region think about and how they think and talk about the security community. So just to make that clear, I hope it kind of answers your question. Thank you. Did I miss anything? I'm good? Okay.
Okay, I think still have time. Yeah, second round, Rocky and Pius. And yes. Okay, please, Rocky first.
Thank you for the excellent talk. My name is Rocky. I'm here with the CSIS Indonesia. I focus on international political economy, so I basically will pivot the question a little bit to economy.
I'll do my best.
I want to ask the question, I wonder if you can talk about whether the security community building of ASEAN can be related to ASEAN economic integration efforts. You mentioned a little bit about securitization, the process of which state actors basically try to securitize and claim non-security matters as security matters. And I wonder how this process can be traced back into the community building practices of ASEAN in security matters and ASEAN's more relatively more successful efforts in economic integration, for example. We see, for example, ASEAN integrated community, and it recently has been more successful in terms of tying down, integrating Japan, for example, Japan, China, and Korea in RCEP. And how does this relate? And maybe you can compare a little bit between the community building exercises of ASEAN politically and economically.
Dr. Martel, I just want to know the polysemic. I just want to know your personal before you write this book. What is your thought about the ASEAN before you read a lot of that in terms of the, because you are raised in Canada, right? Because, you know, polysemic means it's kind of tender, weak. While right now is the ASEAN has the blueprint, right? So, but even though I still, when I want to write something, I still think that ASEAN is very weak when it comes when it comes to Quad, when it comes only the superpower that kind of influence the ASEAN. How does it relate to the South? Right now they call it the global South. Whether you personal before you read that, what is your view until you got that book? Something like that.
Michelle Chimhai from the Canadian Mission. I had a pleasure of attending your session yesterday at the IBB Center. And I like the approach that you took on expanding on the discourse standpoint. As a policy and communication professional, it's always interesting to us to get an idea of the public opinion research, what's being said, engaging the stakeholder positions, and also storytelling, because it provides, it's also an opportunity, storytelling or in communications, a way of branding an organization. So my question for us from the Canadian Mission, knowing ASEAN and also Canada's engagement towards the Indo-Pac strategy, it'll be interesting to explore if you can tell us or share some of the trends you could see unfolding in terms of narratives. Thank you.
Thank you all. I'm trying to decide which order I have to take this. Maybe I start with the backstory of the book. Thank you for the opportunity to get a bit personal, I guess, about the project. So I always struggle answering this question because part of it is now it's become so much part and parcel of what I do that I kind of forgot where I got there myself. So maybe I need to create my own narrative to explain how it came about. And it came about, I think, and that's not the narrative. The non-narrative, or if that's even possible, but the real story is basically it happened as kind of a happenstance, right? So I was initially, as an undergrad student, people in Canada at the time were saying, you know, oh, China is going to be, you know, the center of the world. So if you're looking to develop, you know, if you have an interest in international affairs, then you should study China and you should learn, you know, the Chinese language, and so that's what I did. But ultimately, it sounded, at least at the time, that this is what everybody was so focused on. So I thought I should be doing something else. And what is one place close enough that nobody talks enough about? And it became very clear very quickly that there was a lot to say about Southeast Asia and the way that security is conceived here, given, you know, the tremendous diversity in perspectives, the diversity in terms of challenges that are very salient. But it became quite apparent that, you know, from what I can tell very early on, that the way that people were thinking about security in this particular part of the world was very different from what I had been exposed to. And so I wanted to know more and learn more about that. And, you know, and another element of the story is that I like the food so much. So I found a pretext to be able to eat very well. But no, but other than that, yeah, I think this is kind of the backstory here. And then through that, I started basically focusing on this work initially, and that's what led me to focus on non-traditional security. But I started being very, very interested initially in issues that were related to illicit trafficking and the geopolitics of drugs in particular in this region. And that led me ultimately to learn a lot more about securitization, and then learn a lot more about ASEAN itself and its activities trying to regulate that problem. And so from one step to the other, it became this. But it wasn't a very straightforward process. I didn't know exactly where I was going with this until I arrived. And so, but thank you for allowing me the opportunity to talk a bit about this. Talking about narratives and storytelling from the perspective of foreign policy and including the Canadian angle in here is obviously quite interesting. So part of how I present this project is that, just a number of years ago, whenever you would be talking about the power of language, nobody cared really about the language and discourse other than to say, oh, there's a big gap between rhetoric and action. And this is a problem. And that was the end of the story. And now you cannot go through a day without having a pundit or even policymakers or people from even the military saying what we're in right now is a battle of narratives around the rules-based order or something else. Or to say that, hey, we need a coherent narrative of our foreign policy or defense policy. Everybody is talking about narratives these days. And so I wish, this would mean that I would make a ton of money with this book. I don't think that's the case. Definitely not very hopeful, because this is just not what academic books are for. It's not how it works. But I think the book comes at the right moment, because I think there's a lot of talk about the power of narratives with not necessarily all that much in terms of having developed theoretical and methodological tools to make sense of what narratives actually do. And so I think when it comes to ASEAN's dialogue partners, including Canada, this also matters very much. The way that you tell a particular story needs to align with the narratives of the region itself that you're engaging. And I think, and I can say that because I don't work for the Canadian government, but I think there is more effort that should be carried out by Canada, by others, to develop a narrative that can be understood and recognized in that particular context, and that also shows an understanding for the narratives that are prevalent in this region about how to look at major power rivalry, and just as a reflection of regional perspectives on these issues. And unfortunately, I think a lot of times there is a disconnect between the kind of stories that we tell about what it means to have US-China competition in Canada or even in the US, and what this particular region, including Indonesia and others, how the regional perspectives on this particular problem are shaped. And sometimes that means that there's going to be very different narratives actually, and sometimes the narratives from other actors being presented in this region will sound a little disconnected or tone deaf, and I think this is a problem. It's a problem with an easy solution, but it needs to be paid more attention by policymakers from external partners of ASEAN as well, more and more. And I hope Canada can be one to heed this advice moving forward. Yeah. I think that's it. Oh, right. Yes, I'm sorry. Maybe I conveniently, because I'm so not an expert on the economic side of things. So that was perhaps my attempt. No, I'm kidding. So I don't know that I can actually make the connection that you suggest. And maybe I need to think more about this between, securitization and RCEP. I think what we see in terms of discussion about, from decoupling to de-risking, the notion of risk, I think, is probably where we see that there is a kind of a security angle. The whole discussion about, is it de-risking or is it economic coercion? And depending on who we're talking about, we're going to call the same thing in very different terms, right? So I think perhaps this is where there might be a relation between what I talk about and the economic side of things. But I think I need to think about this some more. But thank you for raising the question. Yeah.
Okay, so Habib, and then is there anyone else want to share comments or ask question? Please, one more if there's any. Okay, no more. Okay, Habib, please.
Dr. Martel, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm Habib. I was wondering when you wrote about 3 different versions of the ASEAN security community, in your perspective, from your perspective, like which version Indonesia's leadership has contributed most? And also, like when you wrote that particular, different versions, what was the nuance between like the mainland ASEAN countries and also like the maritime ASEAN countries? Like, do you see any like irreconcilable, differences between like these 2 groupings? So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. This is a very good question.
Maybe I connect one more.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Thank you, Ibu Lina and Dr. Marcel for the presentation. I am Jonathan. I am a research fellow at INADIS and also a researcher at the Horizon Indonesia and also at Universitas Indonesia, UI. So thank you for your presentation. And regarding when we discuss about the ASEAN security community, sometimes we talk about in literary works here some works which have romanticized ASEAN's development. For example, Professor Kishore of Singapore once wrote that ASEAN is a miracle because it has emerged from a Cold War confrontation and it became an effective regional organization and building peace between Southeast Asian nations which were previously in conflict, like Vietnam, Cambodia, and others. And in addition to Professor Kishore, we also know that Dr. Martin Natalgawa's book about Does ASEAN Matter? And he said ASEAN does matter. So when we see that ASEAN is being romanticized, we see also that it has also impacted policy circles, because I don't know whether there is a connection between Pak Marty's book about Does ASEAN Matter and also how this year Indonesia's chairmanship of ASEAN has taken the theme ASEAN Matters, epicenter of growth. And so do you agree with these statements that romanticize ASEAN as a miracle or as something that does matter or similar stuff? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for these questions. To start with the version that might be more prevalent from Indonesia's perspective of where Indonesia kind of took a leading role, I think, so coming up with these 3 versions was kind of an inductive process, right? In the sense that, some could argue if you look at the blueprint or if you look at even, the initial proposal for the ASEAN security community, which obviously, Indonesia and someone particularly in this room had a lot of, push in making happen. You can see elements of these versions already, probably. I think where possibly Indonesia's role is particular is that I think to some extent you could trace Indonesian intellectual leadership in all 3 versions. At the same time, I think that, and this is where, obviously I go in the book in a fair amount of detail into the kind of historical evolution of ASEAN's project. And, we very well know that this initiative started out as an ASEAN security community. It became an ASEAN political security community. And then the political kind of aspects were, either tabled for a while and then reintroduced. So perhaps we could see, Indonesia's leadership as being perhaps more aligned with the 3rd version to some extent, which is a bit more, might be a bit more controversial for some other ASEAN member states. And here I will say that perhaps, and this is also why I start with the non-traditional security version, because I think this is the one that's probably most consensual among ASEAN member states policymakers, right? This is the kind of story about ASEAN's goal to become a security community. That's the one that policymakers and officials will revert to the most easily, and will say, we haven't had a war in ASEAN for ages, and so we can focus on these other issues. And so this is the kind of common narrative that you will see being put forward by ASEAN officials across, different member states. I think the obviously that means also that the focus on the harder or core, more defense, security issues is going to be a bit more resisted, particularly from the official side of things. The good thing about the book is that what I really wanted to do here is to go beyond accounts that tend to be quite state-centric, right? So we focus on, okay, so there might be different ASEAN member states with different perspectives on security. Obviously, that's part of the story here. But what I wanted to do is to really focus less on the distinctions between states, but more about the diversity of perspectives that can even exist within a particular state and either within a particular even ministry. Right? Sometimes people will disagree, but also going beyond a focus on just state actors to look at experts like those in the room, to look at civil society people who decide that it's worth it to engage ASEAN on peace and security issues and call out the organization for not doing enough. And so I think what the book does is that it gets a bit deeper into what various perspectives exist on what it means to have security, what it means to have community, even within a particular track of ASEAN diplomacy, but also within a particular state. Instead of saying, oh, it's all because, there is the mainland versus maritime divide. I mean, we can unsettle that pretty easily, right? So it might have been the case at some point that you could talk about a CLMV states as one kind of category that we're always resisting, some changes. But now, what to make of Vietnam right now, and also over Vietnam had a pretty key role in bringing about the second, more traditional version of ASEAN security community and pushing for more action on the South China Sea for obvious reasons, right? Again, I'm not denying material factors here. So sometimes I struggle a little bit with this idea that you have this divide between states, because very easily, if you get into a deeper analysis, you find out that these divisions don't necessarily hold up very well. And so I was hoping to offer something else with this book, really. And sorry, I forgot. I'm trying to remember your question. Yes, ASEAN matters. So yes, I do think ASEAN matters. And so in that sense, and it's kind of, it's a good coincidence that one of the last person I actually spoke with, tying a little bit back to this project, is actually Pak Marty himself. And so I share his assessment very much that ASEAN does matter, and that the fact that ASEAN is not the typical, doesn't meet necessarily basically the kind of bias, standard that we have of what a regional organization ought to do to count as powerful and effective and, providing results, etc. The fact that ASEAN is not that is actually not just, maybe we need to rethink about what the standard is actually, because we could say that, the criticism that we wage against an organization like ASEAN is actually not specific to ASEAN. The fact that we talk about ASEAN as being a talk shop, this is a criticism that you hear, when it comes to every multilateral organization in the world. Like there's so many criticisms waged at, the UN or the EU these days for sure, but also NATO is consensus based as well, right? And so at some point, I think, there needs to be a deeper reflection and separation between the kind of criticism that are addressed towards ASEAN and whether this is just about ASEAN itself or whether it's a broader criticism about the fact that we're disappointed by multilateral or regional institutions writ large. But also maybe we need to shift our expectations a little bit of, and it's a convenient way, it's convenient to blame blame it on the regional organizations, but regional organizations or international organizations are really a product of their member states, right? And so it can be very convenient to kind of use ASEAN as a way to lay blame on something. And, you know, maybe we need to, again, go back to the inner demons and ask the right questions. But I think, yeah, we love to criticize multilateralism just in general these days, but I do think it very much matters. And I think that ASEAN has actually more power than it might think that it has. It's just that you need to look and pay attention to sources of power that are not the traditional forms of power, right? So it's not about military power or material power, but ASEAN has a lot of symbolic, normative, and discursive power, in my opinion. And you can see that on display with, you know, conversations around the Quad and the Indo-Pacific. It started out a particular way, and then ASEAN was not happy about the way that it was presented. And so as a result of this, it shifted. And now we can talk about the Quad in ways that, oh, no, it's no longer about the hard security. It's no longer about containment of China. It's much more inclusive. So, you know, is this not a sign that ASEAN matters in the way that it's always able to kind of shift the narrative towards something that it's more comfortable with? You know, I find this to be pretty fascinating for such a weak institution to be able to do that and to have, you know, the United States and others adjust to what ASEAN prefers in that sense. And yes, you can say, oh yeah, it's all rhetoric, and in the end, no, I think that actually how you talk about something will shape the kind of policy solutions that you bring about afterwards. And I think this is a sign that ASEAN is actually much more powerful than we often think it is.
All right. Thank you very much, Stephanie. And Parisa was already out of the room, but I was about to, because since you mentioned it, and then he just texted me just now, he said, it's really, really encouraging and really surprising to see that we still have this discussion about the security community itself, you know. So it's very interesting to hear the discussion, he said. But anyway, I think we come to the end of the lecture series today. And once again, we are very, very privileged, very honored to be able to listen to your presentations, and particularly the story, the ASEAN's never-ending story. And really hope that we can meet together in other CSIS event in the future. Thank you so much for your participation and attendance today. And please join me to give a round of applause for Dr. Stephanie Martel for her excellent presentation today. Thank you very much and have a nice day.